I found out my parents had stolen my college fund the same day I received my university acceptance letter. I thought they were calling me into the living room to celebrate. Instead, my dad slid an empty bank statement across the table and calmly said, "We gave the money to your brother." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. The savings account my late grandfather had built for me over 18 years was gone, every dollar. My mom reached for my hand and said something I'll never forget. "You'll figure it out. You're stronger than he is." At that moment, I realized something heartbreaking. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They believed they had done the right thing. It took me 10 years to rebuild the future they took away from me. And then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, they knocked on my front door asking me to save theirs. Throwaway account because a few family members use Reddit, and I'd rather they hear the truth from strangers than from another edited version of the story at family dinner. I never expected to become the successful child. Growing up, that title always belonged to my older brother, Ryan. Ryan was 2 years older than me, and according to my parents, he could do no wrong. If he got a B on a test, they said the teacher must have graded unfairly. If I got an A, they asked why it wasn't an A+. If Ryan forgot to do his chores, he was busy. If I forgot mine, I was irresponsible. It wasn't subtle. Everyone in the family knew Ryan was the favorite. Even Ryan knew it. He never bragged about it, but he didn't exactly try to stop it either. Whenever something expensive appeared in the house, it somehow ended up in his room. A new gaming console, Ryan. A newer car when he turned 16, Ryan. A laptop for college, Ryan. When I asked if I could have one too, Dad smiled and said, "You don't need expensive things to succeed." That sentence became my parents' favorite excuse. Whenever Ryan got something I didn't, they'd remind me how independent I was. "You're responsible. You're mature. You'll understand." As a kid, hearing those words made me proud. As an adult, I realized they were just another way of saying, "We're not choosing you." The only person who treated me differently was my grandfather. Grandpa Arthur believed fairness mattered. Every birthday, he'd take me fishing. Not because Ryan didn't like fishing, because Grandpa wanted one-on-one time with each grandchild. Whenever I stayed at his house, he'd tell me stories about growing up with almost nothing. He always ended those stories the same way. "Nobody can take away your education." I didn't understand what he meant until years later. When I was 15, Grandpa was diagnosed with cancer. The strongest man I'd ever known suddenly looked fragile. He still smiled, still joked with the nurses, still beat me at chess almost every visit. But we all knew. One evening, while everyone else was in the hallway talking to doctors, Grandpa asked me to come closer. "I've got something to tell you." I pulled my chair beside his bed. "You've always worked hard." I shrugged. "I try," he smiled. "I know." Then he reached into the bedside drawer and pulled out an envelope. "I won't be around forever." "Don't say that," he chuckled. "I'm 91. I've earned the right." Despite everything, he still found ways to laugh. He placed the envelope in my hands. "Don't open it until you're 18. Promise?" "I promise." He squeezed my hand. "And remember, no matter what happens, don't let other people decide how much you're worth." Those were the last meaningful words he ever spoke to me. 3 weeks later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was difficult, not just because we lost him, because the family immediately began arguing over money. Who got what? Who deserved what? Who'd helped him the most? I hated every second of it. Grandpa deserved better. After everything was settled, life slowly returned to normal. High school became my focus. I studied harder than ever. While Ryan bounced between majors and eventually dropped out of community college, I buried myself in books. I joined debate club, worked weekends at a grocery store, tutored younger students for extra cash. Not because anyone forced me, because I had a dream. I wanted to become an engineer. By senior year, I had good grades, solid recommendations, a decent chance at several universities. Then came the waiting. Every day after school, I'd check the mailbox before even saying hello. Most days, nothing, until one Tuesday afternoon. There it was, a thick envelope with the university logo printed across the front. My hands shook before I even opened it. "Congratulations." I didn't read anything after that. I'd made it. I actually got in. I sprinted inside the house. "Mom, Dad, I got accepted." Mom smiled politely. "That's nice." Dad nodded. "Congratulations." That was it. No hug, no celebration, no excitement. Ryan wandered into the kitchen half asleep. "What happened?" "He got into state." Ryan shrugged. "Cool." Then he grabbed cereal and walked away. I told myself not to let it bother me. Maybe they were tired. Maybe we'd celebrate later. About an hour later, Dad asked me to come into the living room. Mom was already sitting on the couch. Neither looked happy. That confused me. Dad placed a folder on the coffee table. "We need to talk." I sat down. "What's wrong?" He looked at Mom before speaking. "You know your grandfather left money for college." I smiled. "Yeah." Grandpa had never told me how much, just that I'd understand someday. Dad slowly slid a bank statement across the table. The balance read, $0. I frowned. "I don't understand." Mom reached for my hand. "We gave the money to Ryan." I laughed, not because it was funny, because my brain genuinely refused to believe what I'd just heard. "What?" Dad sighed. "Your brother needed another chance. He wanted to start a business." I stared at both of them. "That was Grandpa's money." Dad nodded. "Yes, for my education." Another nod. "So why would you give it to Ryan?" Mom answered before Dad could. "Because you're stronger. We knew you'd find another way." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So, you stole it." Dad's face hardened. "Watch your tone." It wasn't stealing. We're your parents. We made the decision we thought was best for the family. I looked from one face to the other. Neither of them looked guilty. Neither of them looked ashamed. They actually believed they had done the right thing. How much was in the account? Dad hesitated, then quietly answered. About $83,000. I felt sick. 83,000. Gone. Years of savings. Years of birthday deposits. Years of Grandpa planning for my future. All handed to my brother without anyone asking me. I stood up so quickly the coffee table rattled. When were you planning on telling me? Mom looked down. Today, the day I got accepted? She nodded. We figured. There wasn't a good way. Ryan walked into the room halfway through the conversation. He looked confused. What's going on? I turned toward him. Did you know? He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me everything. You knew. He rubbed the back of his neck. I told them I'd pay it back. When? I don't know. When the business took off. What business? He smiled awkwardly. I'm still figuring that part out. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because if I didn't laugh, I was going to break. I picked up Grandpa's envelope from my backpack, the one I'd finally opened that morning before school. Inside had been a handwritten letter. No money, just advice. At the bottom, one sentence stood out. This education fund is my final gift to you. Use it to build a life no one can take away. I placed the letter on the table in front of my parents. You didn't just take my money. You ignored Grandpa's final wish. Neither of them spoke. I walked to the front door. Dad called after me. Where are you going? I didn't turn around. To figure it out. Just like you always expected me to. As I closed the door behind me, I had no idea where I was going. I only knew one thing. If I wanted the future Grandpa had dreamed for me, I was going to have to build it without anyone in my family. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning of everything they were about to lose. I didn't go back home that night. I drove around for almost 2 hours with no destination in mind. Every red light gave me another chance to replay the conversation. We gave the money to Ryan. You're stronger. You'll figure it out. The words echoed in my head until they stopped sounding like excuses. They sounded like a confession. They had never expected me to be their priority. By the time I parked outside my apartment, it was almost midnight. I unlocked the door, dropped my backpack on the floor, and just sat there in the dark. My acceptance letter was still sticking out of the front pocket. Just 12 hours earlier, it had been the happiest day of my life. Now it felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost. The next morning, I called the university's financial aid office. The woman who answered sounded cheerful. Congratulations on your acceptance. How can I help you today? I took a deep breath. I lost the money that was supposed to pay for college. She paused for a second. I'm sorry to hear that. Let's see what options we have. For nearly an hour, she walked me through scholarships, grants, federal aid, and work-study programs. By the end of the call, I realized something. My dream wasn't impossible. It was just going to be much harder. Over the next 3 months, I applied for everything. Academic scholarships, essay competitions, local community grants. Anything that offered even $500. Every evening after work, I sat at my tiny kitchen table writing application after application. While my friends spent weekends relaxing, I was answering essay prompts like, describe a challenge that shaped your character. I laughed every time I saw that question. I had plenty to write about. Eventually, the emails started arriving. Congratulations, you have been awarded. We're pleased to offer. One by one, they added up. Not enough to cover everything, but enough to make college possible. The rest I'd have to earn, so I did. During my first semester, I worked 25 hours a week stocking shelves at a grocery store. On weekends, I delivered food. During exam season, I tutored high school students in math. There were weeks when I survived on instant noodles and peanut butter sandwiches because they were cheap. Some nights, I slept only 4 hours. I won't pretend it was inspiring. It was exhausting. There were moments when I genuinely wondered if my parents had been right. Maybe I should have given up. Maybe college wasn't worth this. Then I'd remember Grandpa. Nobody can take away your education. So I kept going. Meanwhile, Ryan's business became the biggest family topic. Every holiday dinner turned into another presentation. Dad would proudly announce, Ryan's got investors interested. A month later, he found a great opportunity. Then, he's almost ready to launch. Except, nothing ever launched. Every few months the story changed. A clothing brand, a mobile app, a coffee truck, a cryptocurrency project. Each idea disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. But the money kept disappearing too. Whenever anyone asked where Grandpa's $83,000 had gone, Ryan always had an answer. Business expenses. I later learned that business expenses included a brand new luxury SUV, a high-end gaming computer, 2 vacations, designer clothes, and an apartment far more expensive than he could actually afford. My parents defended every purchase. You have to spend money to make money. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stayed quiet. By graduation, I had something Ryan didn't. A degree, no trust fund, no financial safety net, just 4 years of hard work. When my name was called during the ceremony, I searched the crowd. My parents weren't there. Neither was Ryan, only Grandma. She stood in the front row holding a small handmade sign that read, Grandpa would be proud. After the ceremony, she hugged me tighter than ever. I have something for you. She handed me a small box. Inside was Grandpa's old wristwatch. I wanted you to have it when you earned your degree. I smiled. I didn't know he wanted me to have this. He didn't, she smiled back. I decided. You earned it. That watch became the only inheritance I actually received, and somehow, it meant more than the money ever could. Within 2 months of graduating, I landed an entry-level engineering job. The salary wasn't amazing, but it was steady. I rented a slightly better apartment, bought a reliable used car, started paying off my student loans. Slowly, life improved. Then one afternoon, almost 5 years after the college fund disappeared, my phone rang. Dad, I almost didn't answer. Hello? His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Ryan's business finally took off. I blinked. What business? The investment company. I thought he was opening a coffee shop. He changed directions. Of course he did. Dad continued talking for nearly 15 minutes about how successful Ryan was about to become. Apparently he'd convinced several relatives to invest. Aunts, uncles, family friends. Even Dad and Mom had emptied part of their retirement savings to help him expand. When he finally stopped talking, he asked, "So, would you like to invest too?" I nearly laughed. "You want me to invest? It could be a great opportunity." I looked around my apartment. Every piece of furniture had been bought with money I'd earned. Every bill had been paid through years of overtime. Every achievement had come without anyone's help. "No," Dad sounded disappointed. "You've always been so cautious." "No," I replied quietly. "I've just learned not to confuse hope with a financial plan." He sighed. "I wish you'd support your brother." I supported him the day I lost my college fund. The line went silent. We ended the call a minute later. I didn't think much about it afterward, until 6 months later. It was a Tuesday morning. I was halfway through a meeting when my phone buzzed. 5 missed calls, 3 texts, all from Grandma. She never called that many times. The moment I called her back, she answered. Her voice was shaking. "Honey, Ryan's company, ... it's gone." "What do you mean?" "He lost everything." I felt my stomach tighten. "What about the investors?" Grandma started crying. "There weren't any real investments. There was no successful company. It was all a lie." I closed my office door. "Grandma, how much did Mom and Dad lose?" She whispered the number. I had to sit down because it wasn't just their retirement. It was almost everything they owned, and before the week was over, they would come knocking on my front door, not to apologize, but to ask me for something they had once promised I'd never need. Money. I found out the full story 3 days later. Not from my parents, not from Ryan, from Grandma. She came over that Saturday afternoon carrying a small tin of homemade cookies, the way she always did. The moment I opened the door, I could tell she'd been crying. She sat at my kitchen table without saying a word. I made her tea. She wrapped both hands around the mug but never took a sip. Finally, she looked up. "They've lost the house." I froze. "What?" She nodded slowly. "The bank started foreclosure proceedings this week." I stared at her. "I thought Ryan just lost the business." "There wasn't much of a business." "What do you mean?" Grandma sighed. "There never was." She explained everything. Ryan had convinced everyone he was building an investment company. He claimed he had wealthy clients. He showed fake spreadsheets, fake profit reports, even fake emails from companies that supposedly wanted to partner with him. For years, my parents believed every word. Whenever Ryan needed more money, he had another explanation. "The next quarter will be huge. We're expanding. I just need a little more capital." Dad emptied part of his retirement account, then another part. Eventually, they took out a second mortgage on the house. They believed they were investing in Ryan's future. Instead, they were paying off his debts. Luxury vacations, credit cards, car payments, online gambling. I looked at Grandma in disbelief. They never checked. They trusted him. I leaned back in my chair. The irony was almost unbelievable. The same parents who had never trusted me had trusted Ryan with everything. Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "They're ashamed." I didn't answer. She hesitated before speaking again. "They're coming to see you tomorrow." My stomach tightened. "Why? They need help." I already knew what that meant. Sunday afternoon arrived exactly as she predicted. At 2 o'clock, someone knocked on my apartment door. Mom, Dad, neither looked like I remembered. Dad's hair had turned almost completely gray. Mom looked exhausted. The confidence they'd always carried was gone. I invited them inside. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "I don't know how to ask this." I folded my hands. "Then just tell me the truth." He nodded. "We're broke." The words hung in the air. "The retirement account is gone. The house," he stopped. "We're trying to save it." Mom looked down at the floor. "We've sold almost everything." Silence. Dad finally looked at me. "We need a loan." There it was, not an apology, not a conversation, a request. "How much?" Dad quietly answered. 80,000. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because the number felt almost unreal. 80,000? He nodded. "It'll stop the foreclosure." I couldn't believe it. The exact amount Grandpa had left for my education. Life had an incredible sense of irony. Dad noticed my expression. "I know how this sounds." "No," I replied calmly. "I don't think you do." Mom finally spoke. "We wouldn't ask if we had any other choice." I looked at both of them. "I had no other choice either," neither responded. "When you gave Ryan my college fund, I worked 3 jobs. I graduated with debt. I spent years rebuilding my life. You told me I'd figure it out." Dad closed his eyes. "I know, so..." I leaned forward. "Figure it out." Mom burst into tears. "Please don't do this. I'm your mother." I looked at her quietly. "And I was your son." Silence filled the room. After nearly a minute, Dad reached into his jacket pocket. "I expected you to say no." He placed a folded envelope on the table. "I wrote something." "What is it?" An apology. I don't expect it to change anything. I picked it up but didn't open it. He stood so. I guess this is goodbye. For some reason. Those words hurt, not because I wanted to give them the money, because they sounded sincere for the first time in my life. My father looked defeated. They walked toward the door. Just before leaving, Mom turned around. I know we don't deserve your help, but I hope one day you'll remember that we did love you. After they left, I sat alone in complete silence. The apartment felt strangely empty. The envelope was still sitting on the table. I stared at it for almost an hour before finally opening it. Inside were 3 handwritten pages. My father admitted everything. He admitted they'd favored Ryan his entire life. He admitted giving away my college fund was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. He admitted they'd confused dependence with love. One sentence stopped me cold. We kept rescuing Ryan because we were afraid he'd fail. We stopped helping you because we were convinced you'd succeed without us. We punished your strength and rewarded his weakness. I read that sentence over and over again. For years, I'd wondered why. Why me? Why was I always expected to sacrifice? Now I had my answer, not because I deserved less, because they believed I needed less. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained everything. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Grandpa's watch sitting on my nightstand, about the letter he'd written, about the $83,000 that changed all our lives. By Monday morning, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to give my parents $80,000, but I also wasn't going to let them lose everything. There was another way, one they would never expect, and it would change our family forever. I spent 3 days thinking about it. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to do, because I knew whatever decision I made would define the rest of my relationship with my parents. Friends gave me different advice. Don't help them. They made their choice. Others said, they're still your parents. People make mistakes. Grandma never told me what to do. She simply said, whatever you choose, make sure you can live with it 10 years from now. That sentence stayed with me. By Thursday, I'd reached a decision. I called my parents. We need to meet. They arrived at my apartment looking nervous. Dad was carrying the same worn-out folder I'd seen days earlier. Mom looked like she'd lost 10 pounds in a week. Neither of them smiled. I invited them inside. Dad spoke first. If this is about saying goodbye, it isn't. Both of them looked surprised. I took a deep breath. I've decided I'm not giving you $80,000. Their expressions fell immediately. Before either of them could respond, I continued. But I also don't want to see you homeless. Hope slowly returned to their faces. I slid a folder across the table. Dad opened it. Inside were printed documents. Apartment listings, a monthly budget, information about a financial counselor, and one final page. I've already paid the security deposit and 6 months' rent on a small apartment. Mom looked up at me, confused. You. What? The lease is in your names. You can move in next month. Dad stared silently at the papers. I also contacted a bankruptcy attorney. They've agreed to meet with you. I paid the consultation fee. Neither of them spoke. I won't give you cash. I'm not going to repeat the same mistake that got you here, but I'll help you start over. Mom burst into tears, not loud sobbing, just quiet tears rolling down her face. Dad folded the papers carefully before looking at me. You didn't have to do this. I know, he swallowed hard. You owe us nothing. No, I don't. Silence filled the room. Finally, Dad stood, then to my complete surprise. He hugged me. It was awkward, short, probably the first genuine hug we'd shared in years. I'm proud of you. Those 4 words hit harder than I expected, not because I'd spent my whole life waiting to hear them, because I had finally stopped needing to. A month later, my parents moved into the apartment. They sold what little they had left. Dad took a maintenance job at a local school. Mom started working part-time at a bookstore. Neither complained, for the first time in years. They were living within their means. Ryan, however, disappeared. He left town before several civil lawsuits were filed. Some relatives never spoke to him again. Others eventually forgave him. I honestly don't know where he is today, and I don't spend much time wondering. Life moved on. About a year later, Grandma invited me over for dinner, just the 2 of us. As we finished dessert, she smiled. Your grandfather would have approved. I looked at her. Of what? You didn't become bitter. You became wise, I laughed. I don't know about wise. She reached into her purse and handed me another envelope. What's this? I've been waiting until the right moment. Inside was a copy of Grandpa's will. One paragraph had been highlighted. If my grandson ever receives this letter after my passing, I hope he understands that true wealth isn't measured by what you inherit, but by what kind of person you become when life treats you unfairly. I stared at the page for a long time. Grandma smiled. I think he knew you better than anyone. 2 years later, my life looked completely different. I had been promoted to senior engineer. My student loans were finally paid off. I bought my first home. Nothing extravagant, just a small place with a backyard. The day I got the keys, my phone rang. Dad, I heard the news. Congratulations. Thanks, he hesitated. Would it be okay if your mom and I came by sometime? I looked around my empty living room. There had been a time when I would have said no without thinking. Instead, sure. The following weekend, they visited. Dad helped me assemble furniture. Mom planted flowers in the front yard. It wasn't some movie ending where everything magically healed. There were still painful memories, still awkward conversations, still things that couldn't be undone. But there was honesty now. And honesty is a better foundation than pretending the past never happened. Before they left, Dad looked around the house. You built all of this yourself, I smiled. Not by myself, he looked confused. I tapped Grandpa's old watch on my wrist. I had someone believing in me long before I believed in myself. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone on my back porch. The house was quiet. The air was cool. I thought about that 18-year-old kid sitting in his parents' living room, staring at an empty bank statement. Back then, I thought they'd stolen my future. They hadn't. They'd only made the road longer. The future was still mine to build. And maybe Grandpa had known that all along. Sometimes people will underestimate you. Sometimes they'll choose someone else. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you will disappoint you in ways you never imagined. You can't always control that, but you can control what happens next. You can let resentment become your identity. Or you can build a life so meaningful that the people who doubted you become just another chapter, not the whole story. Looking back, I never got my $83,000, but I got something worth far more. Proof that my future was never sitting in a bank account. It was always in the choices I made after it was gone.